Time for our debate on the programme, and the question that we're asking this morning is, should greyhound racing be banned? And we want you to have your say on 0833 97 97 97. Joining me on the line to discuss this is Nuala Donlon from Greyhound Action Ireland, and also Senator Eileen Lynch of Fine Gael, who is also a greyhound owner herself. You're both very welcome to Kildare today this morning. Nuala, I'll start with you. And we've spoken to you previously, and it's something that comes up nearly on a yearly basis when it comes to funding the greyhound industry. You believe that greyhound racing should not be funded by the state, and in fact it should be banned. Why?
Good morning, Eoin. Because it is responsible for the death and injury of thousands of dogs every year, essentially, and the Greyhound Board's own statistics tell us that that's happening and continuing to happen. We wouldn't even need it banned in this country. It wouldn't exist without state funding. It's an economic basket case. It hasn't returned a dividend to the state in over a quarter of a century. I mean, it couldn't stand on its own 2 feet economically if public funding were stopped. And apart from the whole, welfare and the serious welfare issues that exist in greyhound racing, there is also the question about is this an appropriate use of taxpayers' money? And I think very many people around this country would argue that it isn't. And the greyhound industry every so often gets Jim Power Economics to produce a report telling us how important it is to the economy. We actually got analysis done of that last Power report produced on this subject. And, I mean, there are serious question marks about the findings of that report. So for those reasons, I mean, we would argue that immediately public funding should be stopped to greyhound racing.
Before we get into the details then and some of the points that you've raised there, Senator Eileen Lynch, I want to bring you in then on this. You're a greyhound owner as well. Your view on this as to why it shouldn't be banned and why greyhound racing should continue to be funded by the state.
Thanks very much, and thank you for having me on the show this morning. Look, I take on board what Nuala has said. I suppose greyhound racing has always been an integral part of Irish society. It's a long-standing tradition. Yes, it does receive funding under the Horse and Greyhound Fund, but welfare and integrity of the industry is at the core of this funding. And since 2020, any greyhound funding which has been allocated from the Department of Agriculture to Rossi Cunaran, that is Greyhound Racing Ireland, 10% of that funding has had to be funded for greyhound welfare and integrity. Last year we saw 20% of that funding was spent on greyhound welfare and integrity. That was 4 million. In terms of employment, I think it's important that the greyhound industry does support social and economic benefits. It supports directly and indirectly 4,000 jobs around the country. And it would be remiss of us to disregard that, I suppose, in the way that Nuala is saying. In relation to not making a return, the greyhound industry returned 133 million benefit to the economy in most recent reports of up to 2 years ago. And I'd just like to ask Nuala, I suppose, in relation to their analysis of the Jim Power report. I'm aware of the Jim Power report, I've read it, but in terms of their analysis of same, I haven't. So I suppose I would just like clarity on that before we start mentioning reports that aren't authorised or that aren't published.
All right, Nuala.
Well, Senator Lynch, that report included coursing greyhounds in the Republic of Ireland. It included hare coursing and racing greyhounds in the north of Ireland. It included dogs exported to the UK when calculating value. It left dogs in the racing pipeline for much longer than is the actual reality. We sent that report to the Public Accounts Committee, and they took the findings of it so seriously that they wrote to the Greyhound Board and asked them to attend a meeting of the PAC so that they would answer the questions that were raised. The Greyhound Board refused to attend and said it would conflict with some forthcoming legal action, which has absolutely nothing to do with our report. The 4,000 jobs you mentioned, if I can just tell you how some of these jobs were arrived at. Somebody working in a betting shop is attributed to have that job. That job is attributed to the greyhound industry in the Power report, even though greyhound racing, I think it accounts for 7% of bets taken in betting shops. So the person working in a betting shop has that job apparently, according to the Power report, because of greyhound racing, and that person is attributed an income of 25,000. Somebody working in a pet food shop that sells pet food, dog food to a greyhound owner, That person has a job as a result of the greyhound industry, and they also have an income of €25,000 thanks to the greyhound industry. This is the sort of stuff in the Power Report. Can I go back to Senator Lynch's claims about welfare being at the centre of everything? The track deaths were released last week for 2024. 4% of the dogs raced in this country last year died on the track or soon after because of injuries they sustained. I watched official race footage of a race from last Sunday, just yesterday. A dog was knocked down on the first bend, and all you could hear over the commentary for the remainder of that race was that dog screaming in pain. Now, this is good welfare practices in the greyhound industry. This would not be acceptable for any other breed of dog, and it should not be acceptable for greyhounds, and taxpayers' money should not be used to fund this kind of cruelty.
OK, let me just go back to Senator Lynch on those figures, because I know Deputy Paul Murphy asked for, the Minister for Agriculture, who of course is Kildare South Fine Gael TD Martin Hayden, and a total of 389 greyhounds suffered injuries at races around Ireland last year, and more than half of them then were euthanised, so 194 of them euthanised by track vets. And Eileen, that is one of the issues that Nuala and other advocates for banning greyhound racing would have, is the number of dogs that have to be euthanised because of injury.
It is a very regrettable statistic. Neither I, as somebody involved in the industry, nor anybody involved in the department or in the University of Conaire wants to see a dog euthanised, wants to see a dog injured. Unfortunately, I think we have to be realistic here as well. Injury is a part of sport, be that racing, be that physical contact sport, be that hurling, football, boxing, soccer. So I think it's remiss to say, this is the only sport in which injury occurs. It's not, and we're all very mindful of that.
Yeah, but they're not. If you suffer an injury in hurling, you're not put down.
I do take that point, but I mean, you're looking at a different sport, and I suppose you're looking at animals here. And the thing is, in terms of greyhounds, they're the most traceable canine in Ireland. They're the most traceable animal outside of cattle. There is a fantastic traceability system, and GRI is doing as much work as it possibly can in terms of welfare. Track surface is being examined, and they're currently carrying out a report analysing all injuries which were suffered by greyhounds last year to see which way they can be reduced. Welfare standards are incredibly high. There are a lot of kennel inspections carried out. If there's an event of mistreatment to be found, I have no problem in taking these people to court. Nobody wants to see a greyhound injured. Greyhounds are treated incredibly well by their owners, by their trainers, by their breeders. And that's what we want to see. Nobody wants to see a dog injured. Unfortunately, it does happen sometimes. Right. And those statistics are regrettable. And everything that can possibly be done by GRI is being done to reduce and prevent that. And government funding is dependent on that happening. As I said, 10% of government funding towards the greyhound industry is ring-fenced for welfare and integrity. And funding is dependent on high welfare standards.
Nuala?
If I could say there on the traceability, we have numerous cases of dogs being registered here to being down on the traceability system here as being rehomed or, under their Irish owners' names. These dogs have ended up in Spain. We have found them in Spain, being raced in Spain. Senator Lynch may be familiar with an instance a couple of years ago where a dog was down and registered in both the coursing club and the Greyhound Racing record books under its Irish owner's name. The dog was actually in Spain and had been raced over 100 times on a track in Barcelona. OK, the track deaths are, I think any dog lover, somebody who professes to love their dog listening to this programme, who does everything they can to try and minimise any harm to their animal, will be listening to this wondering why races are organised where there is an absolutely, totally possibility that in every single race the dog these people profess to love is put out in a track and can be killed or seriously injured. I mean, I just find that argument ludicrous. The problem, and yes, track deaths are and they're higher. In 2024 they were higher than any other year on record. The real problem, Eoin, with greyhound racing is what happens to all the dogs who don't race fast enough, who never race fast enough to get on the track, and then who no longer race fast enough. And they put this famous traceability system in place. It started in 2021. We have been tracking the first cohort of dogs that were born in the year 2021, and we have been tracking them. At the end of October last year, 42% of the dogs that remained in the island of Ireland were dead or unaccounted for. That's 3,252 dogs were dead. Now, most of those dogs are just turning 4. And at the other end, you have what's going to happen to the dogs who are still racing. In the last 5 years, the Greyhound Board managed to rehome less than 8, and I'd say homed, I'm not going to say rehomed because they were never in a proper home to start with. They have homed less than 8,000 dogs in the last 5 years. Now you add a couple thousand more that private rescues around this country who are constantly inundated with unwanted greyhounds, they have homed another couple thousand more. When you consider that in the last 5 years, over 51,000 greyhounds were born into the Irish greyhound industry, and even accounting for the fact that perhaps a third of them were exported, you can see the scale of the problem that exists with unwanted greyhounds.
Do we have to be careful, though, Nuala, that we don't tar all the greyhound owners with the one brush? Because there will be a lot of greyhound owners that are listening in to the programme this morning that look after their dogs, that treat them with the highest regard, and they would say, a lot of what you're saying does not apply to me and does not apply to our yard. So do we have to be careful that everybody doesn't get put under the one category?
I'm not saying that greyhound owners go out and beat their dogs with sticks. That's not what I'm saying at all. That I starve them to death. What I'm saying is that this is an industry which is based on a breeding-centric model. And to get the number of dogs that will make it onto the track, you have to breed thousands more that won't. And that's the problem. It is the inherent nature of the industry. That's the problem here.
Senator Eileen Lynch?
I think what has just been said there is incredibly disingenuous. As somebody who's involved in the industry and has been for most of my life and has never shied away from that, your comment particularly in relation to saying these greyhounds were never homed. I mean, that's a ridiculous statement to make. There is no man or woman involved in the greyhound industry who wants to see greyhounds maltreated. We have some fantastic owners, breeders, and trainers all around the country. These greyhounds are treated incredibly well. Kennels are held to the highest standards. We can go on to talk about traceability, but I've really taken offence on what you said there. In terms of welfare, I'm going to continue. You've had your say now, I will have mine. In terms of the welfare inspections that are carried out, there are kennel inspections carried out across the country by GRI. These can be with notice or without notice. There was a 500% increase last year in the amount of drug tests that were carried on off-site, because GRI do not want to see any greyhound potentially running under the influence of anything which could potentially mask an injury, whether that's an allowed substance or a disallowed substance. To say that greyhounds are not homed is so completely disingenuous and incredibly insulting to the 6,500 people around the country that have dogs and that treat them incredibly well. There may be rogue elements, there are always rogue elements in everything. But to say that greyhounds aren't homed and that are treated badly, and the remiss way in which you speak about, you're not saying that greyhound owners are out there beating their dogs. I mean, that's a laughable comment, and it's just so incredibly insulting.
No, it's
thousands of people around the country that keep dogs and hold good kennels and keep welfare as their top priority.
All right, Nuala Donlon.
I do not consider keeping possibly tens of hundreds of dogs in kennels homed. I mean, most people would consider giving a home to a dog as having a dog living around your house, living in your house, living in your garden. Those are not the conditions in which racing greyhounds are being kept. And please stop trying to pretend it is, that they're sitting inside on sofas having a good time watching telly. That's most people's concept of giving a home to a dog, as opposed to keeping them in a kennel where they're taken out and raced and trained to race. That's what we mean by homed. And you can't get away from the fact that thousands of dogs are dying every year. What's happening to all the dogs that are dying, Senator Lynch? Are they dying of natural causes?
Senator Lynch?
Yeah, firstly, I will come to answer Nuala's second question, but I suppose in relation to the first part, a greyhound is homed if they are well fed, well looked after, and provided with adequate accommodation. There is nothing wrong with a dog being in a kennel as opposed to being in a house. And as I've already stated, greyhounds are the most traceable canine in the country. I wonder, do you share the same concern for pet animals? When you look at the number, the increased number, I think it was up 95%, the amount of dogs which were euthanised in pounds last year. Or is it just that you have an issue directly with the greyhound industry? Now, in relation to the number of dogs that you were saying that die every year, there are a certain amount of dogs that die every year, and those numbers are public information. There are also a lot of greyhounds that are kept as pets by greyhound owners and trainers that are involved in the industry. There are a lot of greyhounds that are rehomed. GRI has recently set up care centres, and there's currently 2 in the country, whereby greyhounds are looked after and, I suppose, prepared for a life after racing in terms of being rehomed or fostered or adopted.
All right. You have to as well, though, just to go back to a documentary that RTE did a couple of years ago, you have to look at the amount of greyhounds that have been sent abroad, and we've heard of greyhounds that are being raced in Pakistan, being raced in India, being raced in other countries when they're deemed not good enough for the Irish industry. So does that not have to be looked at, Eileen? Would you not agree on that?
I would say that some of the findings of that documentary were scandalous. They're absolutely not something that I would stand by. Some of it was very difficult watching. Some of it was true at the time and is in no way true now. I think we can only improve the industry and improve welfare standards as we go forward. And since that documentary, that has been happening. I would say it has been happening for quite a few years, but particularly since 2020, you have seen a massive increase in standards. I'm not going to say everything was perfect. It wasn't. And as I said, I strongly do not in any way condone some of the findings of that documentary. But we can only move forward with the industry and we can only progress. And as I said, in terms of the funding which is being allocated from the government, 10% is ring-fenced on welfare and integrity, and the allocation of that funding is dependent on that ring-fencing. And even last year, Greyhound Racing Ireland put 20% of their funding into greyhound welfare and integrity. So improvements are being made all the time. There has been a lot done, and there is a lot more to do. But it's remiss not to acknowledge the work that is currently being done in terms of welfare and integrity.
I want to read some of the messages because there are a lot of messages, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, coming in to us on 0833 97 97 97, and some are saying yes, ban greyhound racing, others are saying no, don't. So let's get to some of them. One here says greyhound racing has been a way of life in Ireland for many years and should not be banned. Another one says, good morning, my family have been involved in greyhound racing for over 60 years and we treat our greyhounds as family members. When they finish their days racing, they spend their retirement with us, living like kings and queens. I think those against racing need to speak to us owners and get the correct facts about racing and meet our content and well cared for dogs. Another one says, I volunteer for a rescue. They get several calls a week from owners and trainers to take greyhounds. All they're interested in is getting rid of them as quickly as possible. They love them while they're winning and then they're discarded like rubbish when they're not. I can assure you there's more people trying to offload greyhounds on rescues than any other breed of dog in this country. Another one says this is abuse. It's disgusting what happens to these poor dogs. It's all about making money, and when the dog is injured we all know what happens and it's not good. Another one says yes, greyhound racing should be banned. I think injuries in human sports are playing by choice. Greyhounds are not racing by choice. Another one says if you take away funding, you take away regulation, that will lead to a massive welfare problem. This one says let's call a spade a spade. Greyhound owners are out there for one thing, to make money, and that's because one owner told me that Tom says that an owner getting rid of dogs because they weren't winning anymore. And one here says, and I want to put this point to you, Nuala, people say we do, this was on Facebook by the way, because we had a post up on Facebook yesterday and a lot of people were commenting on it. People say we do this for greed and financial gain. The bare minimum I work for is 100 hours per week. I'd make more money working in Aldi for the hours than this. We do it because we love our dogs and are one of the most stringently regulated industries in the country. 3 weeks ago I had a random inspection. All dogs are completely checked over. Beds, paddocks, feeding stuffs, medical records, etc. Then last week had another random inspection where over 20 dogs were urine tested. This is normal practice and there are zero allowances for any substanders, and my licence would be suspended straight away. Your response to that, Nuala Donlon?
Well, could I suggest that individual is not making a living on the basis of earning €100 a week from greyhound racing. And, you know, if Jim Power is right...
100 hours per week, he said.
100 hours, sorry. Well, if Jim Power is right and it costs something like, you know, €14,000 or something like that a year to keep a greyhound, I really don't know where that person is going to get the money to keep all the dogs that he has. Greyhound racing is an industry. We call it an industry. Sure, there are people out there who have a small number of dogs, and it is something like a hobby for them. And in the past, it was practically a hobby. I mean, I remember when I was a child, people are in the area with 1 and 2 greyhounds. That day is gone. It is now an industry. And this idea, if I can go back to something that was said there in one of your comments, that it is an inherent part of Irish culture and a very important part of Irish cultural life. It isn't. The tracks around this country have hardly anybody attending them. The attendance for 2024 were released this week. Again, a decline in attendance at tracks. You know, to say this is an important, and I think even the Greyhound Board itself no longer talks about this as being an important cultural activity. Greyhound racing exists to provide betting content. That's what it exists for, increasingly betting content for online betting companies based outside of Ireland, actually. And I mean, I think if the Irish taxpayers listening to this were to realise that their money is being used to provide content for foreign betting companies and to provide, let's remember that 85% of dogs raced in the UK are bred in Ireland. So we are a breeding factory for UK greyhound racing as well.
All right, more messages.
I mean, that's what taxpayers' money is being spent
Some
on.
more messages because they're flowing in this morning. Anya says, just because it has been done for years doesn't make it okay. I most definitely think it should be banned. They are not much loved pets. They are used to make money. Another one says to us, as breeders and owners of greyhounds, we treat them as family. They get the best of food, clean kennels and regularly visits to the vet to make sure they are in good health. If anyone would like to talk to us or visit our kennels, they are more than welcome. While another one says, it's time for a ban on greyhound racing in Ireland. All the suffering and death for these poor dogs is completely unacceptable. Thousands killed behind the scenes because they are not fast enough. Shame on Senator Lynch for defending this animal cruelty. It can't be allowed to continue, says Phil. I want to just put the final point to you then, Senator Eileen Lynch. We see in Wales that the Welsh Government has set out plans to ban greyhound racing. New Zealand announced similar plans last December. Why do you think other countries are now deciding to ban greyhound racing? Because if it continues in this vein and Ireland doesn't take a similar stance, we could end up being one of the only or the last kind of countries that are still racing greyhounds and funding the greyhound industry, could we not?
I don't think so. I mean, the greyhound industry is still very strong here. It's very strong in Australia. It's very strong in the UK. In England, I am, of course, aware of the decision that was made in Wales. I suppose that was a political decision in light of the MP there. It was one track in Wales, known as the Valley Track. It was a privately owned track, which was opened last year. It's obviously incredibly disappointing for all those that are involved in greyhounds over there and for all staff of the track. But I take the comments that you've made there. But greyhound racing and that tradition is a long-standing tradition here. It's not to everyone's taste and it's not everyone's hobby. In the same way, different people are involved in different elements of sport or different kinds of sport. But for those people that are involved, it's a critical part of their life. The dogs are well looked after, and I think there is a deep misunderstanding of the way in which the greyhound people do treat their dogs. There's a lot of propaganda put out there by groups like Nuala's groups, and I have been at the other side of that in terms of receiving threats and abuse from those kind of groups. But I think it's important that we would look at the reality here and the condition in which the industry is in here, the employment and I suppose the social interaction that it creates, and its importance in that way.
Final response to you, Nuala.
Yeah, please. I mean, I reject utterly that my group has been implicated and mentioned there in the same sentence as threats to Senator Lynch, and I'd like her to withdraw that mark. You have received no threats from Greyhound Action Ireland. What the public has received is information, and you talked a little moment ago about public information and the public know about the thousands of dogs that are dying. The public will only know that because of the laborious attempts by groups like mine who has to use dull questions to get this information because it's not publicly available. And I would like you to withdraw your comment that I have issued any threats to you, Senator Lynch.
Sorry, I would like to clarify, Nuala herself has not. I did not wish that to come across that way. Not Nuala personally.
OK, listen, we'll have to leave it there. Lots to get through on the programme this morning, but thanks to Nuala Donlon from Greyhound Action Ireland and Gael Senator Eileen Lynch, who's a greyhound owner herself. Thanks to you both for joining us on Kildare today this morning. And I think it was important to have balance in that discussion as well, from the Greyhound Action Ireland side, but also from a greyhound owner also. And it is reflected, it has to be said, in the messages that are coming in. There are two sides to it, and it's fairly balanced in terms of who wants to see greyhound racing banned and who doesn't. Another one says, while I don't support an outright ban, I think the greyhound industry should be fully self-funded. If the gambling companies want content, then they can pay for it themselves. Another one says, dogs that are family are not kept in kennels. And then finally says, final message here says, why not get rid of both dog racing and horse racing? Or is there so much of a difference that it's okay for horses but not for dogs? And I know that is, and there's a few messages saying that if we're talking about greyhound racing, we need to talk about the horse racing industry as well. But that's a much broader discussion. This morning we were talking about greyhound racing on the back of the fact that over in Wales they're planning on banning it. In New Zealand they've announced similar plans, and we just wanted to get the perspective here in Ireland, and thanks to both Nuala and Eileen.
Kildare Today with Eoin Beatty.
With Whitewater Shopping Centre Newbridge, Ireland's largest regional shopping centre. Fashion, food, film, all under one roof in the heart of Newbridge. whitewatersc.ie. Kildare FM.